No, Mr. Kang, and before you raise the number again, understand that the number is not why I am walking away. Simone kept her voice level, even as the phone inside her burgundy blazer vibrated for the third time in a minute, carrying an update she could not afford to read before the 12 executives watching her. Across the walnut table, Tae-hyun sat beneath the gray Chicago light, beside a $400 million partnership agreement that could solve nearly every problem Bennett Urban Health had, including one that had become dangerous that morning. 2 hours earlier, Illinois had warned that reimbursement delays affecting 3 major community programs could stretch another 90 days, forcing Detroit construction payments and payroll reserves toward the same shrinking pool of cash. Tae-hyun did not know that yet, and Simone intended to keep it that way until she understood whether he was offering partnership or simply waiting for vulnerability to improve his position. "You are rejecting $400 million, Tae-hyun said, his calm carrying the weight of someone accustomed to hearing resistance only as an opening position. Simone slid the contract toward him and tapped 3 clauses, explaining that one allowed Kang Global to replace independent directors after missed targets, another gave his investment committee approval over expansion, and a third let his company acquire discounted shares if Bennett needed emergency capital. His chief financial officer called the provisions standard investor protection. But Simone had spent too many years watching powerful institutions rename control until the people losing it felt unreasonable for objecting. "You are building a deal that becomes better for you every time we get into trouble," she said. "Then you are asking me to call that partnership." Tae-hyun's eyes sharpened because she had described the structure more honestly than some people on his own team. He asked why control mattered enough to justify the risk, and Simone almost gave him the polished answer she used at conferences, before deciding he had earned something less rehearsed. Her mother had died after missing follow-up care that existed 12 miles away but might as well have been 1,200, because 2 bus transfers, hourly wages, and a clinic schedule designed around somebody else's life had turned ordinary treatment into an obstacle course. Simone built Bennett Urban Health around the belief that vulnerable people should not surrender dignity or decision-making power before receiving help, and she refused to create the same dependency in her own boardroom. "I would rather delay a clinic than build one I can no longer promise to protect," she said. For the first time, Tae-hyun had no immediate answer, so Simone gathered her papers and walked out while the unread messages on her phone continued to accumulate. Maya was waiting in the elevator lobby, her expression tense enough to tell Simone the news had worsened. Once the doors closed, she showed Simone the revised reimbursement schedule, Detroit's next contractor draw, and a cash flow projection that had shifted from uncomfortable to dangerous. "If the state slips past 90 days, we have 11 weeks before we start choosing which promise to break," Maya said. Simone stared at numbers that made Tae-hyun's rejected offer feel suddenly enormous. "Then we find harder money." Maya did not challenge the principle, but she asked the question Simone had avoided since breakfast. "And if harder money does not come?" Simone looked at her reflection in the elevator doors, one hand settling beneath the curve of her 6-month pregnancy, and admitted that she did not know. 27 floors above them, Tae-hyun remained in the conference room, rereading the clauses Simone had marked, until Junho entered with 2 coffees. Tae-hyun called the structure defensible, profitable, and common, which only made his cousin ask why he sounded embarrassed by those facts. "Because she was right about the incentive," Tae-hyun said. "If her liquidity gets worse, the deal gives us more control exactly when she has fewer choices." Junho reminded him that 3 months earlier, Tae-hyun had personally approved the strategy memo recommending those protections because Bennett was founder-dependent and expanding quickly. "That was before I met her," Tae-hyun said. Junho's expression changed. "Meeting someone does not make the analysis dishonest." Tae-hyun looked toward the closed door Simone had used. "No, but it can expose what the analysis forgot to measure." That evening, a public reimbursement bulletin crossed Tae-hyun's desk through Kang Global's routine healthcare risk monitoring, and Bennett Urban Health appeared among the providers likely to face delayed payments. He reopened Simone's financial model, adjusted the timing assumptions, and sat back when the numbers showed what she had concealed without ever lying. Depending on reimbursement and construction timing, Bennett could face a serious liquidity crisis within 3 months. Her refusal no longer looked merely principled. It looked dangerous enough to cost her the company she had spent years building. Tae-hyun stared at the marked contract until Junho's warning returned to him, followed by a question he could not dismiss. If Simone knew how vulnerable she was, and still refused, what had she seen in his offer that frightened her more than running out of money? The question followed Tae-hyun into the next morning, when he opened the original investment memo and read language he had approved 3 months earlier with new eyes. Bennett Urban Health was described as a founder-dependent asset with strong community loyalty, fragile liquidity under aggressive expansion, and governance vulnerabilities that could create favorable control opportunities after a second funding round. Nothing in the memo was illegal, and nothing had seemed unusual when Tae-hyun signed it, because he had spent his career treating leverage as a neutral fact rather than a choice with consequences. Now the phrases felt different because they had acquired a face, a history, and a woman who had looked directly at him while refusing to become the outcome his analysts predicted. Simone received revised terms the following afternoon without a call, deadline, or request for gratitude. The director replacement clause was gone, expansion decisions remained with Bennett, emergency financing converted to non-voting debt, and discounted share purchases during distress had disappeared. Maya read the document twice before looking up. "This is not generous," she said. "No," Simone replied. "It is finally honest." The returns were still demanding, and the reporting requirements still extensive, but the structure no longer rewarded Kang Global when Bennett became weak. Simone refused to mistake a better contract for a better man, so she invited Tae-hyun to the Englewood clinic alone, without lawyers or a presentation. He arrived in a black sedan that looked absurd beside the cracked parking lot, then surprised Simone by stepping out alone and signing the visitor log when the receptionist pointed to it. She walked him through examination rooms designed for mothers who brought children because childcare was unavailable, refrigerated medication lockers, a legal assistance desk, and 2 narrow rooms used for specialist visits by patients who could not afford to cross the city. Tae-hyun asked about margins until Simone showed him a postpartum room converted from storage, where nearly 200 weekly visits generated little profit but prevented women from traveling across Chicago for routine follow-up care. "Why keep a service that loses money?" he asked. "Because losing money and being unnecessary are not the same thing," Simone said, and Tae-hyun understood why every model his team had built felt incomplete. At the end of the tour, Maya and 3 department heads waited with a single-page governance covenant. Simone explained that any strategic investor would have to accept permanent protections for clinical independence, patient access, and executive authority over care delivery, even if growth targets were missed, except in cases of fraud, insolvency, or regulatory failure. Tae-hyun said the protections would make the investment less attractive. "I know," Simone answered. "That is why they matter." He asked whether she would insist on them if reimbursement delays worsened, and Simone understood immediately that he knew more about her financial position than she had told him. "You saw the state bulletin." Tae-hyun did not deny it. "It is public, and we monitor the sector." Simone held his gaze. "Then you know I have fewer options than last week." "Yes." "And you still removed the distress provisions." "Yes." That answer changed the test without ending it. Simone told him not to present the covenant as another concession required to win her signature, because a board could negotiate around a principle its own chief executive did not believe. Decide whether the stronger party should sometimes give up leverage because using it would damage the thing being built, she said. If you do not believe that, your directors will know. Tae-hyun folded the page into his coat and asked how much time she would give him. 72 hours. 48 is enough. Then take 72. Because if you decide too quickly, I will assume you are trying to impress me. The smallest hint of amusement touched his face before he left. Kang Global's board was less amused. Harold Whitmore argued that limiting intervention before insolvency converted risk management into sentiment, while the chief investment officer reminded Tae-hyun that shareholders were not paying them to admire a founder's principles. Tae-hyun defended the economics of trust, arguing that Bennett's patient loyalty and community relationships were assets that could be destroyed by the same control rights designed to protect Kang's capital. After nearly 3 hours, the covenant passed by one vote, with additional reporting and liquidity reviews. Tae-hyun called Simone only after the room emptied, and when she asked whether he had supported it because he still wanted the deal, he answered with a pause long enough to matter. At first, yes, he said. By the end, I realized I would support it even if you still told me no. Simone looked at the covenant she had expected him to reject, and understood that accepting the partnership might require something more frightening than resisting his power, allowing him the chance to prove he could change. The partnership was signed 11 days later, without champagne, speeches, or the false warmth Simone distrusted in business photographs. She chose sparkling water. Maya checked the execution pages twice, and Tae-hyun pulled out a chair when he noticed Simone had been standing too long, then returned to his own seat before the gesture could become a performance. The agreement solved Bennett's immediate financing problem, but Simone knew documents only mattered when circumstances turned unpleasant, and the first unpleasant circumstance arrived less than a month later. Illinois reimbursement delays deepened, pushing Bennett's projected cash flow below the threshold required by the new liquidity covenant, while Detroit contractors refused to extend payment terms again. Maya presented 3 options before sunrise: delay Milwaukee hiring, renegotiate construction schedules, or draw on the emergency credit facility attached to the Kang investment. Visibility is not control, Maya said after watching Simone hesitate over the credit line. Simone knew that intellectually, but every bad quarter in her career had taught her that investors became most interested in boundaries when someone else was vulnerable. She called Tae-hyun and explained the reimbursement delay, construction exposure, and reserve assumptions without minimizing any number. He asked about payroll, receivables, and patient volume, then told her to use the facility because it existed for exactly this problem. Simone asked what Kang would do once oversight activated. Review the reports. Ask questions you will dislike. Expect answers and then go home, he said. When she challenged whether it could really be that simple, Tae-hyun replied that taking control would be simpler, which was why restraint required a contract. The board approved the draw that afternoon, and for 6 weeks, Tae-hyun did exactly what he had promised. His team requested information, questioned assumptions, and challenged forecasts, but nobody tried to replace managers or dictate clinical operations. The real surprise came during a joint review when Eric Wallace, one of Simone's department managers, objected to a reporting workflow she had imposed to satisfy the partnership. He argued that nurses were documenting every exception manually, even though patient volume had risen 12%. And when Simone told him to redesign the process, Eric reminded her that she had rejected the redesign the previous week. "The data requirement is theirs," he said carefully. "The exhausting part is ours." The room became quiet enough for Simone to hear the old fear beneath her anger. The fear that one visible mistake would become evidence she had never deserved authority. Instead of defending herself, Simone asked who agreed with Eric. One nurse manager raised her hand, then another, then Maya, and the humiliation was sharp enough to show Simone why powerful people often punished honesty before examining it. She closed her laptop, admitted she had solved the wrong problem, and ordered a 2-week test that preserved quality checks while shifting managers toward exception review. Tae-hyun remained silent until everyone left, then told Simone that changing a decision without humiliating the person who challenged it was rarer than she realized. She accused him of enjoying the moment, and he admitted he had enjoyed it slightly, which made her laugh despite herself. When her lower back tightened, he moved a chair with better support closer without touching her, a small choice Simone noticed because it offered help without assuming permission. Their trust remained fragile enough that neither named it, and perhaps that was why the regional consortium proposal created immediate danger. The offer promised 3 hospital systems, 2 mobile care contracts, and enough financing to accelerate Detroit and Milwaukee simultaneously, but one clause required Bennett to share patient flow data across the consortium. Simone saw the implication immediately. Commercial partners could influence referral patterns toward higher-margin systems without ever ordering Bennett to close a clinic. Tae-hyun agreed the provision was dangerous, but Kang Global's board saw something else. Joining would reduce Kang's projected exposure by nearly 18% over 2 years, and Harold circulated a memo urging Tae-hyun to pressure Simone toward acceptance. Tae-hyun refused, telling his directors that Bennett's chief executive was not the custodian of Kang Global's convenience, but Harold warned that the board had begun questioning whether Tae-hyun's judgment remained independent. Tae-hyun told him to evaluate the decisions on their merits, yet Harold did not argue further, which unsettled him more than resistance would have. That evening, while Simone's team searched for alternatives, an email arrived from Bennett's outside counsel, containing a document produced during a routine partnership review. Simone opened it, expecting another financing schedule, and instead found Tae-hyun's original 3-month-old investment memo, including one sentence highlighted in yellow. Bennett's founder dependence and projected liquidity pressure may create an opportunity for governance capture after the second funding round. She read the sentence twice, then a third time, and every fear she had worked to question came rushing back with evidence attached. Simone did not call Tae-hyun immediately, because anger made people reach for simple explanations, and she had spent too much of her life fighting simple explanations about herself. She read the entire memo instead, including sections describing Bennett's community loyalty as an asset, Simone's leadership as both a strength and a concentration risk, and emergency capital as a possible path to future control. Tae-hyun's approval appeared on the final page, with a date 3 months before their first meeting, which meant he had not merely inherited the strategy from subordinates, he had believed it. Maya found Simone in her office after 9, sitting beside a cold dinner with one hand over her stomach. "Do you want me to call counsel?" Maya asked. Simone shook her head. "First, I want to hear whether he tells the truth when lying would be easier." Tae-hyun arrived 40 minutes after Simone sent him the memo without explanation. He entered alone, saw the printed pages, and stopped before reaching the chair. Simone asked one question. "Did you approve this?" Tae-hyun looked at the signature page and answered yes. He did not claim the language was taken out of context, blame analysts, or remind her that the final contract no longer contained those provisions. "So when I accused you of designing a future where I would need your permission to run my own company, I was not imagining it." His voice changed. "No." Simone stood carefully. "Then why did you let me believe I had misjudged you?" Tae-hyun met her eyes. "I never said you had." The answer forced Simone to hold two truths at once. Tae-hyun had entered the relationship willing to use her future weakness as an opportunity, and he had later dismantled the structure that would have allowed him to do it. She asked when the change became real, and Tae-hyun said he did not know the exact moment, only that the clinic tour made the memo feel morally incomplete, and the first board fight made retreat feel dishonest. "That sounds convenient now," Simone said. "It is convenient," he replied. "It is also true," she asked whether he would have changed anything if she had accepted the original deal without reading closely. Tae-hyun was silent long enough to answer before speaking. "Probably not." Simone looked away, because that frightened her more than the memo. She told him the partnership could not continue as though nothing had happened, and Tae-hyun agreed without asking what decision she was considering. Bennett's board would receive the memo, the timeline, and a formal review of every remaining right Kang still held, while Simone would decide whether trust built after deception could survive proof that her original suspicion had been correct. Tae-hyun offered every related document and permission needed for Bennett's directors to review the history. Before leaving, he added one fact she deserved to know. Harold had helped draft the original governance strategy and still believed abandoning it had been a mistake. The next morning, Harold called an emergency Kang Global meeting before Tae-hyun could circulate the disclosures. He argued that sharing internal strategy materials would create legal exposure, and warned that Simone might use them to renegotiate under reputational pressure. Tae-hyun replied that Bennett had already received the memo through ordinary review, and hiding related documents now would be worse. Harold then made his real argument, accusing Tae-hyun of allowing personal attachment to compromise discipline and reminding the board that the consortium could still reduce Kang's risk. "You have spent months giving up leverage," Harold said. "At some point, restraint becomes negligence." Tae-hyun answered that leverage was not automatically valuable simply because it existed, but the vote that followed was closer than any before it. By Friday, both boards were tense. The consortium deadline was approaching, and Bennett's outside lender had requested additional assurances before releasing Detroit equipment funds. Simone's directors were furious. The old memo had never been disclosed, while two argued that ending the Kang partnership immediately would be emotionally satisfying and financially reckless. Simone refused to let anger decide for them. She ordered a full rights audit, asked Maya to model a phased Detroit opening without consortium financing, and told counsel to identify exactly what Bennett would lose if the partnership terminated. Her greatest test was no longer whether she could resist Tae-hyun's power. It was whether she could judge the man he had become without pretending the man he had been did not matter. Late that evening, Tae-hyun sent Simone a signed recommendation that Kang permanently surrender every remaining step-in, right tied to liquidity distress. The proposal would increase Kang's risk precisely when its directors were questioning him, and Simone understood what it might cost. She also understood something harder. If she accepted the waiver only because Tae-hyun sacrificed enough to make her feel safe, then his cost could become another form of leverage between them. She closed the document without replying, knowing the next decision had to protect Bennett without turning forgiveness into a debt. Simone entered Monday's Bennett board meeting with 3 folders: the rights audit, Maya's phased expansion plan, and Tae-hyun's proposed waiver. She told the directors that ending the partnership would not erase the original memo, just as keeping it would not erase the fact that Tae-hyun had changed course before anyone forced him to. Their responsibility was not to reward remorse or punish history. It was to decide whether Bennett remained structurally protected when pressure returned. Council confirmed that the existing covenant already blocked most forms of operational takeover, while Tae-hyun's waiver would remove the last liquidity-related step-in rights without changing Kang's reporting access. Maya then presented an alternative financing package built from slower state-backed debt, an equipment partnership, and a phased Detroit opening that would delay full operations but avoid surrendering patient flow data. The plan was painful enough to feel real. Detroit's maternal care wing could open first, primary care would follow 6 weeks later, and Milwaukee would begin with mobile services before the permanent site reached full staffing. Executive bonuses would remain frozen. Several non-clinical hires would move into the next fiscal year, and Simone would have to face communities she had promised more and explain why expansion had slowed. One director asked whether rejecting the consortium was still rational. Simone answered that faster growth was useless if outside incentives could redirect the system Bennett built, but she also acknowledged that principle did not excuse poor execution. "If we choose the slower road, then we owe people more discipline, not less," she said. The board approved the phased plan by 1 vote and conditioned continuation of the Kang partnership on formal adoption of Tae-hyun's waiver. At Kang Global, the same waiver triggered the confrontation Harold had been preparing for. He argued that surrendering the final step-in rights without compensation was an unnecessary transfer of value, and proposed that the board instruct Tae-hyun to withdraw it. When Tae-hyun refused, Harold requested a review of his authority over the Bennett investment. Junho stayed quiet until asked directly, then told the directors that Tae-hyun's original memo had correctly identified Bennett's vulnerability, but wrongly treated that vulnerability as an opportunity rather than a threat to the partnership. Harold accused him of rewriting business principles to protect family. Junho replied that pretending an old assumption remained intelligent after evidence changed was not discipline. It was vanity. The vote failed to remove Tae-hyun's authority by 1 seat, and the board approved the waiver after preserving financial reporting, fraud protections, and insolvency remedies. Tae-hyun signed without asking Simone for anything in return. Before council transmitted the document, Harold stopped him in the corridor and said Simone would eventually choose her company over him if circumstances became difficult enough. Tae-hyun answered that she should, because the partnership had become worth preserving only after both sides accepted that neither person was entitled to the other's surrender. Harold shook his head as though the idea belonged in a speech rather than a balance sheet, but Tae-hyun no longer needed him to understand it. The lender released Detroit's equipment funds 2 days later, and Bennett rejected the consortium unless its data control provisions were removed. The consortium declined, confirming how important those rights actually were. No dramatic rescue followed. Construction remained behind schedule, reimbursement delays still hurt, and Simone spent an uncomfortable afternoon telling Detroit community leaders that the full opening would move 9 months later than promised. She expected anger and received some, but she also received questions, and one older woman who thanked her for explaining the trade-off instead of offering a polished excuse. On the flight back to Chicago, Simone realized she had spent years believing leadership meant preventing disappointment, when sometimes it meant choosing which disappointment protected the future. Her relationship with Tae-hyun did not repair itself through one waiver. Simone kept meetings formal for several weeks, asked harder questions, and reviewed every major decision with scrutiny that would once have offended him. Tae-hyun answered without demanding that his recent choices cancel his earlier ones, and gradually the tension between them changed from suspicion into accountability without humiliation. One evening after a quarterly review, Simone asked why he had not revealed the original memo once he knew his thinking had changed. Tae-hyun admitted that shame made silence feel harmless. because the dangerous provisions were already gone. I thought changing the behavior was enough, he said. Simone looked at him. Sometimes people need the history too, so they know what the change cost. Tae-hyun nodded. I know that now. A week later, Simone was 36 weeks pregnant when she insisted on visiting the Detroit construction site despite her physician's request to reduce travel. 2 hours into the review, fatigue forced her into an unfinished reception chair while Maya finished with contractors, and Simone felt embarrassment rise before pain did. When Tae-hyun called that evening, he did not tell her she had been reckless. He asked why resting still felt like failure. Simone admitted that too many people had waited too long for proof she could not carry the weight. Then every time you refuse help because they might judge you, he said, you are still letting them make the decision. Simone closed her eyes, knowing he was right, and wondered whether the final thing she needed to surrender was not control of her company, but the belief that freedom required carrying every burden alone. 3 weeks later, Simone gave birth to a healthy daughter named Grace, after a long labor that exhausted every instinct she had for managing outcomes. Maya handled the executive team. Bennett's board followed the succession plan Simone had finally agreed to complete, and nobody called unless a matter genuinely required her. Tae-hyun did not appear at the hospital uninvited or send flowers large enough to become a statement. He sent a small card through Maya with 4 handwritten words. No reply required. Rest. Simone kept it beside her bed because the restraint made her smile and because she understood how different the gesture was from the man who had once designed a contract around the assumption that vulnerability created leverage. She returned to Bennett 3 months later on a reduced schedule and discovered, with some discomfort, that the company had survived without becoming less hers. Eric's redesigned reporting system had reduced documentation errors while cutting overtime. Maya had negotiated another reimbursement extension without Simone touching the call, and Detroit's maternal care wing remained on schedule for its delayed opening. The old version of Simone might have experienced those facts as proof that she was becoming replaceable. Instead, they felt like evidence that she had finally built what she claimed to want, an institution strong enough to protect its purpose without requiring one person to carry every decision. When a young operations director disagreed with her during her first week back, Simone listened before answering and privately noticed how much work it still took not to hear disagreement as judgment. Tae-hyun's changes proved less graceful. Harold remained on the board, the failed authority challenge had not disappeared, and several directors watched the Bennett investment closely enough to make quarterly reviews difficult. Tae-hyun no longer treated that friction as evidence he had lost control of the room. He answered questions, accepted limits, and occasionally lost arguments without mistaking the loss for humiliation. More importantly, he began reviewing other investments for distress provisions that rewarded Kang Global when partners became weak, forcing his team to distinguish between managing risk and manufacturing dependence. The work was slow, expensive, and far less dramatic than transformation looked from the outside, which perhaps made it more convincing. Detroit opened its maternal care wing on a windy October morning, 9 months later than Simone had originally promised. There were no celebrities and no oversized ceremonial check. Only nurses, construction workers, neighborhood organizers, patients, and the ordinary scissors Maya bought after Simone joked that phased openings required phased ribbon cuttings. Tae-hyun stood near the back rather than beside Simone, because the clinic belonged to Bennett and the community before it belonged to any investor. Simone did not pretend the delay had been a hidden blessing. She admitted they had missed the original date, explained why they had rejected faster money, and thanked the staff who carried the consequences. When the doors opened, the first patient entered holding a sleeping infant, and Simone felt the memory of her mother return without crushing her. Later that evening, after the crowd thinned, Simone found Tae-hyun alone in the unfinished primary care corridor. She told him that when she first rejected his offer, she thought she understood exactly what kind of man he was. Tae-hyun said she had not been entirely wrong. No, Simone replied, I was incomplete. She had believed power was what he valued most, when in truth he valued it because losing control frightened him more than he understood. Tae-hyun accepted the judgment, then asked what she had valued. Simone looked through the glass doors toward the clinic she had delayed rather than surrender. Proof, she said. Proof that nobody could dismiss me without eventually regretting it. She admitted that building a life around proving people wrong had made victory feel strangely similar to captivity. because every decision still belonged to people she claimed no longer mattered. Tae-hyun asked what happened when neither of them needed to win anymore, and Simone answered that perhaps they could finally learn whether they liked each other outside conference rooms. He asked if she meant dinner. Simone said one dinner, no lawyers, no investment committee, and no attempt to turn the evening into a strategic acquisition. Tae-hyun smiled and called the last condition unnecessarily personal. "You will survive," she replied. And when they walked toward the exit, neither led nor followed. Months later, their relationship remained imperfect, private, and more ordinary than either had imagined. Simone still led a company that sometimes disappointed investors. Tae-hyun still answered to a board that sometimes rejected him, and neither mistook affection for agreement. What changed was quieter and more durable. Simone learned that accepting support did not reduce her freedom, while Tae-hyun learned that power meant less when its only proof was someone else's surrender. The $400 million deal that began between them never became the most valuable thing they built. The valuable thing was trust strong enough to contain history, disagreement, accountability, and choice without demanding that either person disappear inside it. Years of fighting had taught them both to survive closed doors, but together, they learned that not every door needed to be bought, forced, or defended. Some only needed to be opened from both sides.